Welcome to this special edition of the Blue Room, where I will be chatting to Chris Evans, author of Gary Lineker, a portrait of a football icon. Gary Lineker, very much a player with mixed reviews from Everton fans, I think, or mixed opinions. I think it was a lot of probably because that 1986 team didn't fulfil its eventual potential, but we'll go into all that in a minute, I'm sure. Chris, thanks for joining us. Just before we start, just want to give everyone a little bit of background about what you do and your thought process behind writing this book.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Les. So I am a freelance writer. I've write for hire, mainly done stuff for 442 for the past decade, done stuff like BBC Sport, Guardian, all sorts of different titles. I've done a couple of books with Bloomsbury now. So I did How to Win the World Cup for the 2022 World Cup, and then this one, which is the biography on Gary Lineker. So Gary Lineker, a portrait of a football icon.
It's the first one in 30 years. Does he seem reluctant to do these things?
Well, I mean, it's something that I think he's done a few different books here and there, but I think it's perhaps when it's if he was doing an autobiography, perhaps he's waiting until he's finished, because I guess he'd still tell you he's very much still quite current. But from our perspective, we saw an opportunity there that there hadn't been a biography so long, and actually people hadn't perhaps gone into the details of some of his media career, and also kind of like the later times in Japan. So I think the last one had been in the 90s, just as he was about to move there. So there hadn't been anything on him then. So we thought there was a gap in the market to do something.
Yeah, definitely. I would like to finish on the Nagoya Grand Passade stuff, because that was a very, very interesting move at the time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But before we go into that, I just want to pick up on the title of the book, A Football Icon, which I found really interesting, because he's the sort of player with the goal scoring record that should really make him a football legend for many clubs. Do you feel that from writing this book, because he never attained that status at Everton? He wasn't there one season, and it was a season that ultimately ended in failure. I really hate talking about that season. I was 9 years old, and it still irks me to this day. But he never became a legend at Everton. But every club he went to, he had at least pretty much a 1-2 record, goal scoring record. Maybe Leicester, he's considered a legend, but anywhere else, do you think any clubs consider him that, or is he strictly an icon?
Well, I think, we went with the title of icon simply because he's obviously done so much more than just being a player since then, and he's scaled two careers, two highly competitive careers, which is quite incredible in a way. So it's kind of like summing all of that up. So we kind of went with icon in that sense, but I suppose, look, in terms of legendary status, it's difficult, isn't it? And actually, I spoke about this on the previous podcast, where people were talking about legends of the game like Maradona. But how did he compare to them? So Maradona recognised Lineker as the best goal scorer of that era. But I suppose at a time when there wasn't as much football on TV, if you heard about a player like Maradona, people would be excited. You'd hear about him before you saw him. I suppose Lineker's great skill was reading and understanding the game, his intelligence, and getting on the end of things and scoring goals. Now, he didn't do it with anywhere near the same pizzazz as some of these other players. And I think that's what it is, that perhaps he wasn't the player that got you off your seats, but he was the man for the big occasion. So he would always be the one you relied on. I think that's where there's perhaps that sort of feeling, because he was a very sort of, he had a job to do, and he did it incredibly well, but he perhaps wasn't the flair players that perhaps he was alongside at the same time.
Yeah, I suppose you'd have the tricky winger setting it up, and then he'd be at the back post or in a 6-yard box to finish, which is like, that's what everyone wants, because everyone wants goal scorers. But when it's not that flashy, he is kind of just doing the striker's job. It's probably not recognised as much. And he never really had a dark side either, did he? Which always adds to a player's mystique, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think he was always very smart, though. I mean, he was part of his makeup to be quite calm, and I think he realised that was such an asset for him, that if he could almost kind of disappear in games for 20 minutes, and people would be like, Gary Lineker, he's sorted, but he could just suddenly turn up with a turn of pace and knowing where to go. He'd be there and he'd get on the end of something. And I think that was all kind of part of what he was about. And I suppose being calm and almost kind of being able to kind of hide in the shadows was kind of worked out quite well for him. Whereas if he'd been a big blustering striker backing into people all the time and getting in defenders' faces, then they wouldn't be able to forget about him.
Yeah, that's true. I think also to that end as well, you look at his early career, he had seven seasons at Leicester, scored 103 and 216 appearances, which is a brilliant goal scoring record. But it makes you think, how did it take that long for anyone to sort of pick him up? Because, Everton signed him in 85, 86. He was at Leicester from 78, 79. That seems like an awfully long time, doesn't it? Before one of the bigger clubs comes sniffing round.
Well, I mean, there's a feeling that that Lineker, you'd assume by today's standards, someone was going to be like, almost England record goal scorer, England captain. You'd think that they'd have had him marked out from really early on that this kid was going to be really special. But actually, it wasn't quite the right story at Leicester. There were other players who were coming through with similar sort of age who they thought were going to be better, or people were talking about, more excited about. And Lineker, when he first made his debut, no one really knew who he was. He was out on the wing. It took him a few months to then play again. And that was only because there were injuries and illness kind of coming in. So it kind of went like that for the first couple of years, where he had to take his opportunities, but he wasn't a guaranteed starter. But then eventually, when he started scoring, that was it. But I think it's one of those of a time that he scored so many goals in the second division, but people weren't seeing it all the time, and he had to prove himself in the first division. He did that eventually, but he kind of had to show that he was worthwhile to move to a bigger club. And I think he didn't want to leave Leicester unless it was for a bigger club. So he promised them when his contract was running down that he wasn't going to leave for a side that he considered to be of a similar sort of level. And I think Sheffield Wednesday, Aston Villa sniffed around, but Everton were league champions, and it was just that sort of step up that got him. So I suppose in some ways, there's quite a credit to Everton, really. That it was them that prized him away.
Yeah, definitely. Because leading up to that move to Everton, I think he was joint top scorer in the 2 seasons previous or something. Certainly in 84, 85, I think he was joint top scorer. Obviously went to Everton and scored 40 goals in 57 games, which is just an absolutely incredible return. But just to go on to that Everton team then, it's kind of the accepted wisdom, and this is purely because this is the team that won things, I think. I mean, it was a great team. The 84-85 team is the archetypal great Everton team of the 80s. Arguably, the 1987 team was a better achievement by the manager because the circumstances under which they won that title were pretty incredible. Then sandwiched in the middle, you've got this team to build on 84-85. Lineker signs, and you think, I think he was a club record signing. Joint top scorer in the league the season before. He definitely added a new dimension to that team. I still can't quite work out why that team never won either the league or the FA Cup. I think we sort of went 60% of the way through on top, and then the last sort of 40% we dropped off in the league and in the FA Cup. I just want to talk about some of the players you maybe spoke to make the book from that Everton team, and what their thoughts were on him coming into the team. Because I think Andy Gray left in that summer, and Kendall didn't see that there was room for the two of them. So Andy Gray was the one to go. Big favourite amongst the fans, big favourite amongst the team. So that would have maybe put Lineker on the back foot coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. I spoke to a few Everton players from that time. So, Graham Sharp, Neville Southall, Paul Bracewell as well. So you kind of getting a good feel for what was going on. I spoke to a few of the different fans and journalists around at the time as well to kind of get that sort of rounded feeling what it was. Now, I think you mentioned, 40 goals and how that kind of came across. Well, Neville Southall kind of put it down. Obviously, he was injured towards the end of that season, and he was one of the few players that went down injured. And he didn't kind of make that as an excuse, but he'd said, well, actually, sometimes you can do everything, but the ball just doesn't quite go in, or something happens, or there's something that's a bit of misfortune. And I think that's almost what it was. I think it was fine margins all the way through. But yeah, I mean, when he first joined, I think he wasn't the most popular signing, Lineker, because like you say, Andy Gray was there and he was a hero, and he'd been such a big figure, as well as a big character, for having turned Everton around from kind of being towards the lower reach of the league to actually winning the league and winning, trophies and all of this. So then to see him go was tough, because it wasn't a squad game then. So it was like, if you're not going to start, then off you go. And the whole famous story was that Howard Kendall turned up as Andy Gray and his wife were unpacking at the new house and said, "Oh, you better stop now, because you're off to the Villa." And apparently Andy Gray, or so Graham Sharp tells me, was the first call that he made was to Graham Sharp, and he said, "Sharpie, come and join me at the pub." And they went to the pub, and he told him that Howard Kendall had said that Lineker was coming in and he was leaving. So yeah, I mean, there was obviously that. I mean, that sort of emotional bond. And again, you know, I think a lot of the goals pre-Christmas that Lineker scored when he did start scoring, so I think it took him 3 games or so to get going. He scored a lot of his goals away from home. And again, that lack of TV coverage means that there were a lot of Everton fans who watched him week in, week out, who didn't see him scoring anywhere near as prolifically as they'd been promised. So I think there was a little bit of time for everyone to get used to it, but there was also a different style of play. And I think, again, you know, everyone would have noticed that because it was quite a marked change. So I think, again, you know, that sometimes that's going to bring cynicism if the results don't follow, because Everton had done such a wonderful job of you know, winning the league the previous year. Naturally, you're going to start questioning, well, why have we changed this if it was working before?
Yeah, I mean, that does come down on the manager, I suppose, there, doesn't it? It was, you know, it was his decision to bring Lineker in, which on the face of it seems like a no-brainer, to be honest, because, you know, he wanted to come to Everton. We got him. He was the most coveted striker in the country at the time, really, I suppose. And he did his job, really. I think you're right. I've sort of looked back at the results from the back end of that season. Liverpool just went on a ridiculous run at the end of the season. It was outrageous. I don't think we actually conceded that many goals, but it was a really fine margin. I think we maybe didn't win 2 games. Had we won one of them, we would have, I think, won the league. I need to brush up on that. I think that was the case. But the big one it comes down to was probably Oxford, that everyone remembers, the Oxford United game. Ideas asked me on Twitter, can you ask about the Oxford United away game when his boots were lost, misplaced? Can maybe put that one to bed as well. Did this affect him majorly when playing the game and the chances he missed, or was it less of an issue that was made out? We lost 1-0 and effectively handed the league to Liverpool. If you watch back the highlights to that, there were about 3 or 4 good chances that 9 times out of 10 he scores, and it just didn't happen. Did you speak to him or anyone about that game?
Yeah, I spoke to. I mean, all of the Everton guys that I spoke to for that chapter, I spoke to about that game. And again, I mean, Neville Southall, again, being the way that he is, he was kind of like quite deadpan and said, "Well, look, I mean, how can you put it down to one player, and how can you say he scored 40 goals? So it's, you know, he got them into this position in the first place." But yeah, look, obviously the boots didn't go with him. He had to borrow some boots. And I think there were 2 elements there. I think they weren't quite the right fit for him, but also he'd worn this same pair of boots all the time. Superstition-wise, he was playing well, scoring goals, so he'd keep playing. And this old tatty pair of boots went with him everywhere, apart from Oxford. And yeah, you're right. He missed a few chances, and who's to say, you know, whether it was the boots or not? Because I mean, he did miss chances. I mean, this was one of his things. And again, we're talking about being calm, that he's got a brilliant ability to move on. So miss a chance, move on. Every top striker needs that. So it's not rare for him to have missed chances, but the fact is that he didn't put any of them away, and then made significantly worse because Oxford scored late on and he won it. So, but I think, yeah, I mean, there was a sort of responsibility for him. And, you know, as much as Neville Southall might say, oh, you know, it's not Lineker's fault, but I think Lineker himself, you read back some of the things that he said before about this, and you feel like he did take some responsibility, because, again, I mean, lost twice against Leicester that season. And while obviously it's not his fault, because he came from Leicester, there's that sort of thing about, you know, there's that sort of Lineker link, the Lineker thread all the way through. And I think he felt some sort of responsibility, even though, you know what, 40 goals, what can he do, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of think as a striker, you probably can't do much more than that, can you? You know, scoring that many goals in a season. If the team doesn't eventually win any silverware, it's probably not down to you, to be honest. But yeah, it's always that. It's always a very interesting dynamic he has that with Everton fans, is that sort of. I mean, I loved them as a kid. I even bought a pair of Quasar boots because of Gary Lineker. Just prized me away from Adidas to wear a pair of Quasar like he did. But yeah, there is that kind of that funny relationship. I think a lot of that comes down to him obviously just going after the one season. Something else I want to pick up on that is his move to Barcelona. So there's lots of theories around this. Obviously a massive move at the time. Barcelona were buying up all sorts of players from the English game. My mate Paul's asked, would he have stayed at Everton had the European ban not occurred? Has he spoken about it? Especially as he said, that's the greatest team he's played in. Just to pick up on that, he has said that a few times now, that that's the greatest team he's ever played in, the Everton one of '86.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the closest he came to winning the league over here, right? So it stands to reason. I mean, he loved Leicester, but I think they finished 16th twice in the first division when he was there. So yeah, no, it makes perfect sense that this team, this talented Everton team, would be the best. I mean, I think in terms of the move to Barcelona, I think that it's hard to say 100%, but a lot of British players were moving abroad at the time because of that. So undoubtedly, whether it was because teams out on the continent realised that these British players were more likely to be available, therefore were showing more of an interest, or whether it's because that was the opportunity to play European football, it would have had an impact in some way, shape, or form. I think that the story goes with that. That you've got the hat-trick against Poland kind of opened that up for him. I mean, I don't think that wasn't quite true. I mean, I know there was the whole thing towards the end of the season, even then, that Barcelona had shown a little bit of an interest, and there'd been a lot of talk about Howard Kendall going to Barcelona as well to replace Terry Venables. And while that didn't happen, there were some people, whether rightly or wrongly, felt that Kendall was perhaps looking to feather his own nest and take Lineker with him, because Barcelona needed a goal scorer at that time. So, there'd been a bit of an interest. It had gone a bit quiet. And then prior to that Poland game, while the World Cup was going on, Barcelona had made contact with Lineker's agent and said, should we, would be good to meet up. Can we see if there's something that we can do here? During that time, then the hat-trick was scored. And Lineker didn't know anything about it at the time, because there'd been a meeting at his family's house, and Wayne, his wife, were involved, all of this, and they decided, well, let's not tell him while he's out playing for England. And they said, look, we'll put the move on the back burner until he's finished and England are out. So these things, there were things moving behind the scenes, but I think it does rankle a little bit with Everton fans, because he kind of went to that World Cup as an Everton player and never really came back as one. And there was also the way that it almost felt inevitable, didn't it? And I think the whole BBC interview as well, and there was, it kind of felt like Everton.
Was that the one with Venables, the TV interview with Venables?
Yes.
Yeah, that was very strange, that, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you'd never get that now, right?
No.
The agents would be saying absolutely not. But, Lineker then, I mean, he kind of dead batted the question, but there was like a cheeky glint in his eye, and he looks at Venables while he's doing it. And, it is what it is, I suppose. I mean, you live in Liverpool, you live in Barcelona, probably first thing before you even think about football. The weather's a little bit better in Barcelona.
Yeah, I can't argue with any of that, to be honest. Yeah, I've had a question from Roger here. He does Blue Monday with us. I think I know the answer to this already, but he says, does he regret going to Barcelona?
Well, I didn't speak to Gary, so I don't know whether he did or not, but I think he seems quite proud of having played in Barcelona. I think, does he regret it in a sense that, perhaps if he'd stayed at Everton, he might have won a title there? I mean, who knows? But I think he enjoyed his time out there, and he had a good relationship with the fans, and he really went to go and immerse himself. I mean, there were a lot of players at the time that went over to different countries on the continent and didn't really try. They didn't learn the language. They didn't try and get involved in the culture. But Terry Venables said, Lineker 100% would have, got himself involved. He learned Spanish early on. He was trying to get involved, and he wanted to be part of that. And I think, it seems to be a thing that Lineker does, is that he likes to try new things, and he enjoys the opportunity to challenge himself. So Barcelona was a massive challenge then. And, let's not forget, like in the 80s, it's not like now where Barcelona is only a couple of hours away. The world was a lot bigger place then. And, this was a big move for him. And, prior to leaving Leicester to go to Everton, he lived at home with his parents. And then when he moved to Everton, that was a big move for him, because that was the first time he wasn't in Leicester and he wasn't under his parents' roof. So, these are all big things for him to do, but I don't think he regrets it. Certainly, I've not come across anything that suggests that he does.
Yeah, he did also win the Copa del Rey and the Cup Winners' Cup, so that's not to be sniffed at either, is it? Just on the Spanish thing as well, I remember there was a great interview with him. I think he scored against Spain, and he was asked, how did it feel scoring against a Spanish club? And he's like, I played for a Catalan one. which I just think it's just.
Yeah.
I mean, if you PR savvy, that's just the best thing to say, isn't it? It's very much typical of him. He's a very switched on fella in that regard, isn't he?
Yeah. Oh, I think he knew even during, years before his playing days finished, he kind of had one eye on what he wanted to do next. And I spoke to Gordon Milne, who was his manager at Leicester, and then actually at Grand Passat as well. And he said, even as a youngster, Lineker was interested to understand the media. He wanted to know how they did their intros. His England teammates, some of them called him like Junior Des, wasn't it? They called him because he was quite keen to understand what was going on, with all the media around like the World Cup. So he knew, and he also, there was a feeling that he understood not to lift his head above the parapet and spoil that. So he was very well PR trained. He's got a good group of people around him who kind of made that work as well. And yeah, look, I would say that the way he has found his way in two big careers, and arguably a third coming as kind of like a podcast mogul, is because he's intelligent and he knows the right things to do. He knows the right things to say. And I think even with the controversy about some of his political views, I think he's very in control of what he's doing. I don't think there's at any stage that he's doing anything emotionally.
Yeah, just on the controversy on his political views, I think that's only because it offends a certain type of person who seems to have a bit of a grasp on the media. But we won't pull at that thread just now. I've got one more question from Ian, who's asked: was there anything to sort of suggest that he was shocked that Everton didn't come back in for him when he left Barcelona? Because obviously he went to Spurs. Ian Rush had done a move to Juventus, and he went back to Liverpool. So what was the feeling on that? Did you speak to anyone about that?
I think Everton did have a look from what I've read. So looking back, there were stories linking Everton with trying to get Lineker back. I think there were more high profile attempts. Like I think he'd spoken to Ferguson at United as well. But yeah, I think it was the Venables pull that did it. But yeah, I think Everton were looking at the possibility, and I think they would have loved to have had him. But yeah, like, I think ultimately, Man United got turned down as well. And yeah, the opportunity to play for Venables, but also I think he liked the idea of joining up with Chris Waddle as well. But obviously Waddle then left a couple of weeks after he joined Spurs, so that never came to fruition. But I think that was quite a big thing for him as well, because he didn't play for any. In terms of people he played for England with, he played the player he played most times with was Chris Waddle. So right. And they came through at the same time and all of that. So he knew that it would have been created for him. And I think that was perhaps the tipping point. Yeah,
and also in 88, well, 89, 90, I think it was, wasn't it? Everton was a very, very different proposition to the one he'd left in 1986. Just to move away from Everton then finally, the Nagoya Grand Passat move, that's one that's always sort of captured my imagination, really, because not many players before, or if any players before or since, have moved to the J League. Was the league in its infancy at this point? Was he like the big signer to try and...
Yeah, well, there were three of them that they'd found that they wanted. So I spoke to Pierre Littbarski, who was one of the other ones. So Pierre Littbarski, Lineker, and Zico were the three. Now I don't know Zico, but I can say Pierre Littbarski is a lovely bloke, like really nice, really polite, really softly spoken. All of these things that perhaps Lineker is, who's just like the German version almost, like really good humoured. So you kind of feel like, okay, well they'd wanted somebody, as with the Japanese culture, someone who was squeaky clean in that sense. So yeah, these guys went over there and they were the three big stars. And I think that Lineker always had thought that he was going to serve his last year of his Spurs contract before leaving, but then this opportunity came about. And although he narrowly missed out on the Golden Boot that season, his last year at Spurs, he'd started noticing that he was slowing down and he perhaps wasn't the same player that he was, which seems incredible considering the numbers that he still got. And I think Ian Wright picked him in the last minute of the final day to win the Golden Boot. But yeah, I think it was a move that appealed because, again, this whole idea, similar with Barcelona, that he was going to go over and enjoy a new culture and try something different. And again, not only did he try to learn Spanish when he went to Barcelona, but he spent the months before moving out to Japan learning Japanese, which is a completely different ball game to try and get your head around. So he, this was something that he was really keen on doing. And I think he liked the idea of having this responsibility on him. And actually, whether he knew it or not at the time, but I think it paved the way quite nicely for him to go off and be a BBC presenter and have this sort of like extra focus on his life, because in Japan everything was about him. When he was there, the cameras, the fans, they were all focused on Lineker, and I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah, and crazy to think he was only 34 when he retired.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, he didn't really play. I think he played 13 times out in Japan, but he had problems with his toe.
Yes.
There's quite a graphic story you kind of pick up that he there was an issue with his toe, that he'd be given an injection, a pain-killing injection, and told to go and play, and it was like, "Can't be fine," and had an X-ray, nothing they'd seen, and he went out there and his toe almost kind of balled up at half time. And he went in there really excruciating pain, and they had a look later, and he should never have been able to go and play. And also his toe had almost, like the toe bone had separated away from the rest of his foot. And he had a lot of trouble with that. And I think, there'd been a few little issues. Obviously, didn't know it was as extreme as that beforehand. But yeah, he did have injury issues out there. So it was kind of natural that it came to an end. I think Middlesbrough tried to get him to come back. Southampton as well, I think I read that, tried to tell him, "Oh, don't retire, come back." But he knew his time was that. And I think he regretted not being able to do more for Grand Passate over there. He did a lot from a PR perspective, but he perhaps didn't feel he did as much on the pitch as he'd have liked, I think.
Yeah, and then how soon after that did his Match of the Day career kicked off? Because did he start on Match of the Day and then he went on to things like They Think It's All Over and those kind of shows?
Yeah, so I think he was a pundit for a little bit on Match of the Day, so that's how he'd started. But he didn't really want to be a pundit full time, because I think he felt there was only so much he could say. So he could talk about how to be a world-class striker because he was a world-class striker, but he felt he couldn't really comment in quite the same way on the defenders and stuff like that. So he was keen to get into presenting, and again he'd got this relationship now with Des Lynam, and the BBC had seen that potentially there was something there, but he wasn't a natural at it. In the same way they'd been as a footballer, he'd obviously got some talent, but he knew that to be the best of the best, he'd have to make some ground up. And he went away and he learned from Des Lynam, and he understood what he needed to do. And he took some time on Grandstand. He had like a show that he did on 5 Live. They then like the idea of trying to bring him out a little bit more and have a little bit more character. So, They Think It's All Over was a big thing for him to do. So this was all part of what he was building up to. And he was still doing his Match of the Day punditry, and as well as doing some of the presenting. But then it's when, he did the golf as well for a little bit. But then when Des moved to ITV, this opportunity came up a lot sooner than he thought. And then he was given the opportunity to go in at the Match of the Day from the late 90s, and that's how a lot of people now remember him, because he's been around for so long doing that job. It's quite incredible, really, that there's he's managed to hold on to that for a quarter of a decade is incredible.
Yeah, it does kind of feel actually there will be generations of people who just see him as a TV presenter first and foremost, and then we'll find out he had a really good football career before that and be like, hang on a minute, where's this come from?
Yeah. Well, this was one of the part of the reason why I wanted to do the book, really, that there was, there's people who perhaps forgotten some of his career and kind of how it all came together. But there's so many people who just do not know anything about him. They might have heard the odd story that he's doing. I think the BBC kind of doing the Match of the Day top 10 podcasts, and then obviously when he's gone to do his own, he tells a few more anecdotes and stories than he'd done, and that seems to be a relatively recent thing. So I don't recall this being something that he's always done, and I think that's part of it, because I think he's one of England's greatest ever strikers, and so many people perhaps haven't got any idea of quite how good he was.
Yeah, it does feel like that, and I think just to finish, that perfectly encapsulates a sort of Everton career for me. It's sort of, he was an exceptionally good player, but it's kind of forgotten just how good he was. For a lot of the reasons that you've mentioned earlier. But yeah, I suppose his England career was pretty much the same, and I think a lot of it, unfortunately, comes down to the amount of trophies you win or the big finals you get to, and that's something that eluded him internationally, wasn't it?
Yeah, internationally, he was the main man you look back at those 86 and 1990 tournaments, but I think in 86 he wasn't considered a definite starter, despite the fact he scored 40 goals. But I think there have been a lot of players. Kerry Dixon, who I spoke to, was in the squad, and also won the joint golden boot with Lineker. He scored a lot of goals, and a lot of other people had, but never really cut it at international level. And England weren't scoring loads of goals. And Lineker the same. Like, he'd scored his first goal against the Republic of Ireland, scored a hat-trick against Turkey, and that had been it. And I think that was in about 12 or 13 caps at the time. And he'd actually only scored in 2 matches. So by the time he got to that Poland game, he thought he might get dropped. He didn't. Yeah. Obviously, they moved things around, and he scored a hat-trick, and that was that. But yeah, he grew into that almost very suddenly. And he was then the talisman, the guy who scored the goals. And I mean, that goal in the semi-final in 1990, the way he takes the chance, the way he takes the penalties in the quarter-final before that. But I think it's one of these where he's another, like all England players, you kind of have Bobby Moore as your legend, Jeff Hurst as your legends, because they won that trophy.
Yeah.
And you have some of these others who are like great players, but they're perhaps not immortalized in quite the same way, because they always have that sort of tinge of heroic failure almost that comes with them. But I think that's just part and parcel of being an Englishman, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I do remember that Poland game vividly. It was the first World Cup. I remember the 86 one. I remember that game vividly because obviously because it was an Everton player doing the business at the World Cup for England. Chris, that's been brilliant to speak to you. Really appreciate you coming on. Just want to tell everyone again what your book's called, where we can get it.
Yeah, Gary Lineker, Portrait of a Football Icon. It's available all good bookshops. But yeah, Amazon, Bloomsbury website, all sorts of places. So yeah, keep an eye out. You'll be able to find it.
Great stuff. Thanks again, Chris. Really good speaking to you.
Thanks for having me on, Les. Appreciate it.